Gather around, y'all. I feel it's about time I tell y'all about a railroad folk hero. He was a damn fine man, the pride of Uncle Sam, and his name was Casey Jones. No, not that one, you nerd. Jonathan Luther Casey Jones was an American railroad engineer born in 1863. He grew up with a love of locomotives and eventually got a job working as a brakeman on the Mobile and Ohio Railway. When yellow fever struck the states in 1887, he managed to quickly work his way up to fireman, landing a job firing freight locomotives in 1888 for the Illinois Central Railroad, eventually reaching his lifelong ambition of becoming a driver 3 years later in 1891. He drove freight trains and was known to get her there on the time advertised and never be late. He also had his own personal locomotive whistle made up of 6 thin tubes that sounded something like this. People living close to the railroad came to recognize it as Casey's own trademark. Casey always had a good attitude and frequently joked with his fellow enginemen, leading many to enjoy working with him. If you were on the footplate with Casey, you were in for a good day. After running passenger trains for a short time at the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893, he became very acquainted with the engine he was driving, number 638. After the event, he requested that he drive the engine back to Water Valley, where it was to operate. Jones liked the engine so much he ended up driving it for most of his railroading career. He was a very eager man, always trying his hardest to land better paying jobs and work his way up to driving passenger trains. Despite being liked by many and held in high regards by peers, Jones was considered a somewhat reckless driver. By 1900, he'd been issued with 9 citations and had been suspended from driving for a total of 145 days. Supposedly though, the penalties for being late were much worse than those for breaking the rules. Despite this, he was also regarded as a hero, as he was always concerned for the safety of others, despite his recklessness. An example of this was when he saved a young girl from being ran over on his way to Michigan City in 1895. He had slowed his engine down so he could walk onto the running board and oil the locomotive while it was still moving. As he was about to return to the cab, he spotted some children dart in front of the train some 60 yards ahead. One girl froze at the sight of the train in the middle of the tracks. Jones called to the other driver to reverse the engine while also calling for the girl to move, seemingly in the same breath. Seeing the imminent trouble, Jones raced to the front of the engine and braced himself on the cowcatcher, reaching out as far as he could to grab the girl and safely move her from the rails. In 1900, Casey was transferred to Memphis, Tennessee, where he worked passenger trains between Memphis and Canton. He had to leave his beloved number 638 back in Water Valley, but was happy with the new engine he drove, number 382, which came to be nicknamed Old 382 or Cannonball after the service it ran. 382 was fitted with his custom whistle and he drove it for a few months before he ended up dying a hero. I don't quite have all the details, but the story roughly goes like this. On the 29th of April, Casey's train departed from Memphis 75 minutes late. It was a foggy and rainy day, and it wasn't helped that the line was known for having tight and tricky curves. Jones was making up for lost time, managing to gain back 70 minutes before having to wait in a siding for another train to go by. Casey tried to stick to his word of on the advertised time, but he didn't know that 3 separate trains were waiting in the station at Vaughan. The last few wagons of a freight train were sitting on the main line after an air brake broke while shunting to let Casey's train pass. Jones had managed to make up time and was running at roughly 75 miles an hour when he rounded the blind bend into the station. The fireman, Simeon Webb, spotted the wagons and warned Jones. Jones told Sim to jump and quickly sounded his engine's whistle to warn anyone in the caboose of the train ahead. He slammed on the air brakes and put Old 382 in full reverse, but the engine was still going too fast. In the time between applying the brakes and the impact, Casey had slowed his train down from 75 miles an hour to 35. Casey's train plowed straight through the caboose and 3 wagons before coming to a stop. Despite the mess, everyone on board the passenger train survived with little to no injury, and only a few workmen were hurt trying to get out of the way. Only one person died in the accident. Casey Jones. His engine was wrecked and buried in an embankment along with the wreckage of the caboose and 3 other wagons littering the rails. Supposedly, when Jones's body was recovered, it was found still clutching the brake and whistle, with his skull crushed and his right arm torn from its socket. Had Jones also jumped, it would have likely been a much more fatal accident. He was soon transported via railroad to the church he was married in. From there, he was taken and buried in a local cemetery. Around 15 enginemen rode roughly 118 miles from Water Valley to pay their respects. Afterwards, many would visit the scene of the accident to see the imprint in the embankment left by the engine. Corn that was scattered from the broken freight car grew for years in surrounding fields. There's a plaque marking the location of the accident in Memphis. Jones had a wife and kids, was liked by all, and respected everyone, even his fireman on the night of the accident, Simeon T. Webb, who was African American. Since the incident, there have been many references to him in the forms of folk songs and other media, such as the Ballad of Casey Jones. Despite being little more than a folk tale nowadays, the story of Casey Jones is another example that not all heroes wear capes. Some of them drive trains. Once upon a time, there was a dark age where steam locomotives didn't exist, and frankly were an alien concept. However, that didn't stop one mad lad from building the world's first steam engine able to move under its own power. The name of this lad was Richard Trevithick, son of a mine owner born in 1771. As a boy, Richard would watch the large steam engines used to pump water out from the mines and eventually became an engineer at Ding Dong Mine in 1797. The engines used to pump water were massive, using low-pressure steam which would then raise up into a condensing gear, which would in turn operate the pump. While they worked, they were big, so Trevithick got the mad idea to start experimenting with high-pressure steam, something most people didn't like to use because of how dangerous it was. Trevithick wasn't the first to try and use strong steam as it was known, as he was long-time neighbours with William Murdoch, who had developed a model steam-powered carriage. This made Trevithick realise the potential of high-pressure steam, as it would mean an engine wouldn't need a condensing gear and could use significantly smaller cylinders, saving weight and space. He experimented for a while, coming up with many designs for stationary boilers for mines and factories until he eventually built a small, mobile engine that came to be known as Puffing Devil. He showed it off on the Christmas Eve of 1801, carrying 6 passengers around Camborne. After 3 days of testing, the engine broke. It was left under shelter with the fire still burning while Trevithick and friends went to the pub for dinner and a few pints. All the water boiled away from the engine, which caused it to overheat and catch fire, destroying it. Unswayed, he built another engine. It was built by the Coalbrookdale Company and supposedly was a rail locomotive. Nobody knows quite what it looked like or how well it worked, as most records of the engine were lost, with the only record of its existence being letters written by Trevithick to his friend Davis Giddy. All we do know is its basic design, that it ran on a 3-foot plate railway, and that it was responsible for the death of a worker. This was enough for the company to lose interest in the project. Trevithick went back to the drawing board and soon came up with another road-based engine that was later known as the London Steam Carriage. Him and his partner, Andrew Vivian, patented a steam coach fitted with one of Trevithick's high-pressure steam engines. The new design was driven around London for about 10 miles between Holborn and Paddington, clocking speeds between 4 to 9 miles an hour while carrying roughly 8 people. Despite being a technical achievement, the passengers complained the ride was uncomfortable, the carriage was expensive to build, and noisier compared to a horse-drawn carriage. It wasn't until Trevithick and his colleague crashed the carriage into some house railings that they decided to abandon the project, selling the engine from the carriage to a mill that made metal hoops for barrels. Later, in 1803, a pumping engine Trevithick built for a mine in Greenwich exploded, killing 4 men. Trevithick put the accident down to user error, but this didn't stop rival pumping engine builders from using the story to scare people away from high-pressure steam. Trevithick used the experience to make his boilers safer, firstly by fitting a safety valve that would blow off steam if the pressure became too high. The second was by fitting a lead plug to the bottom of his boilers. Water in the boiler would keep the plug from melting, but if the water dried up, the heat would melt the lead, causing it to safely blow out all of the pressure. Soon, he went on to build what many would consider the world's first successful steam locomotive. He built a high-pressure boiler to drive a hammer for the Penny Darren Iron Works in 1802. In 1803, he came back and asked if he could mount the engine on wheels and turn it into a locomotive. Once it was put together, on the 21st of February 1804, he demonstrated his creation to the world, with much interest from the general public. The ironmaster that patented Trevithick's engine made a bet with another ironmaster for 500 guineas that the engine could pull 10 tons of iron along the 9.75-mile line connecting the mine to the ironworks. The engine hauled 10 tons of iron, 5 wagons, and 70 men along the line in 4 hours and 5 minutes, averaging 2.4 miles an hour. While not exactly fast, the fact that it moved itself and the load at all was impressive. After some more demonstrations, it was found that the engine worked best when running on a level surface. The rails, however, would need to be reinforced as the weight and movement of the engine broke the short cast iron plates that made up the track. The engine was later put back into the ironworks and used as a hammering engine once again. Trevithick was asked to build another engine to run near Newcastle, but it was much too heavy for the wooden rails it ran on. A working replica of the Penny Darren locomotive was commissioned in 1981 and currently resides in Swansea. Later, in 1808, he refined his steam knowledge into a new locomotive called Catch Me Who Can, which was much better in design and performance over his previous locomotives. It only ever ran on a small circular piece of track in Bloomsbury and was part of his steam circus, which cost 1 shilling for a ride. The intent was to show that steam travel would be faster than by horses, but the weak tracks used and the lack of public interest led it to being the last locomotive Trevithick ever designed. 4 years later, Matthew Murray had designed a much more successful locomotive using some of Trevithick's ideas, but by then, Trevithick had retired from locomotives to work on other engineering projects, marine vessels and designing new types of boiler. Richard Trevithick is likely the biggest name you can point to when asked who invented the steam train. Sure, he didn't perfect it, but if it wasn't for him experimenting with high-pressure steam boilers, then Matthew Murray likely wouldn't have been able to perfect his designs, which in turn inspired George Stephenson to build Rocket and so on. So if ever you think you're not going anywhere with an idea, keep at it, because you could be laying the foundation for something much bigger. We've all heard of railway fever, right? Most train enthusiasts claim to have had it as some sort of joke, you know, bitten by the railway bug, can't get enough of them and all that. But what if I told you that around the Victorian era, railway fever was a real thing? Or, as the newspapers called it, railway madness. By the 1800s, Britain was changing rapidly. The design of the steam locomotive was refined enough to be safe and practical, allowing railways to become significantly more efficient and a much better alternative to canals for transporting goods. As more and more railways sprang up, more and more people were able to travel along them as passengers. What was once a trip that would take nearly an entire day by horse now simply took a few hours by train. Truly they were revolutionary machines. For some people, however, they may have been a little too revolutionary. For some reason around the 1850s, there grew a troubling number of reports of men suffering from bouts of madness while travelling on trains. Seemingly ordinary, everyday gentlemen would pay for their tickets, step into their compartment, and once the train was underway, seemingly go crazy. Some would climb out of compartment windows as the train was travelling, while others would strip completely naked in the company of other passengers. You also have to remember that, at the time, Victorian railway carriages were still mostly based on horse-drawn carriages in design, with them having small, separated compartments with no connecting corridors between them. So once you were sat in your compartment, there was no getting out or moving around. Unfortunately, railway madness wasn't confined to just climbing out of windows and stripping down to nothing but what God graced you with. It also made quite a few travellers turn violent, attacking fellow passengers who were trapped with them in their compartment until the next stop. One man on a trip from Carnforth to Liverpool supposedly started laughing in a deranged manner and acting erratically before drawing a gun and attacking the windows of the carriage he was in to get to the other passengers. When the train stopped at Lancaster, he quickly calmed down. However, once it started moving again, he became aggressive and unstable once more. Another was of a Scottish aristocrat who stripped all his clothes and began to lean out of the carriage window ranting and raving. Once he left the train, he regained his composure, and, hopefully, his clothes as well. Another story the newspapers were happy to report was of a burly sailor catching a train with his wife, when he was suddenly overcome by a fearful madness and began accusing other passengers of robbing him. He tried to climb out of the window but was restrained by other passengers, who had to try and pass on a message down the train to the guard to warn him of the madman. After getting off at the station, the man supposedly continued trying to attack passengers, resulting in the police and quite a few station staff having to work together to subdue and arrest him. What some accounts of the story forgot to mention was the sailor was possibly suffering from delirium tremens, a rapid onset of confusion caused by withdrawal from alcohol. Nonetheless, he was still known as one of the many accounts of people going batshit bananas simply from travelling by train. Need I add the story of the man who climbed out of his carriage and moved along the narrow outside ledge to try and climb into another compartment? An American man wrote a letter to the Times in 1854, remarking that he'd never travel in an English railway carriage without a loaded revolver for fear of being locked in with a madman. So what caused this pandemic of passengers resorting to violence? Well, nobody's quite sure. Many newspapers and doctors speculated that it was the speed and motion of the railways that caused it. The rocking of the carriage mixed with the sound of the engine, the speed of the train and the visuals of the countryside whizzing by, all the while confined in a small space, would cause an imbalance in the brain or simply be too much for the mind to deal with, and thus drive the poor soul to insanity. Some speculated that it wasn't entirely the railway's fault, but rather the rapid modernisation of the world. Going from horse and carriage to 50 miles an hour on a train while factories and cities got bigger and the way society changed because of this may have been too much for some people. And all it took was a ride on a train for it all to set in. This was backed up by some former explorers remarking that such violent behaviour was unheard of in less developed countries. Some even believed that it was a result of lack of masculinity, and that railways caused men to suffer from the same types of hysteria that were believed to only be present in women. Oof. Despite these random acts of madness, it wasn't unheard of for railways to cause some genuine mental issues for some people. Charles Dickens struggled to travel by train after being involved in a railway accident in 1865. His children noted how he'd grab hold of the chair and look straight at the floor. He would sweat and tremble. Another traveller joked that the upset he experienced in an accident was so great it helped cure his rheumatic fever. But these were accidents that resulted in trauma, not just the experience of travelling by train. Eventually, as railways became more and more a part of everyday life, cases of railway madness began to disappear. It's unknown why it ever happened in the first place, but the Victorians' obsession with shock stories naturally made it very well known to the public eye. While other rumours and myths about railways were soon blown off as bogus, such as women's uteruses flying out of their body if they went too fast, or you simply melting for travelling at speeds faster than that on horseback, railway madness was a genuine issue. Whatever the reason, it must certainly have been tense to travel by train. So next time you're travelling by train, count yourself lucky that the chances of you being trapped with a lunatic for the rest of your trip is much slimmer than it used to be. Unless you live in New York. There have been many films that centre around trains or have trains star prominently in them. From Back to the Future to the Titfield Thunderbolt, many filmmakers have shown their love of locomotives through the art of film. There was, however, one filmmaker that may have created the greatest train film of all time, which tragically lost him his creative freedom. Joseph Frank Buster Keaton was a big-time Hollywood actor and stuntman in the 1920s during the silent era of cinema. He was born into a vaudeville family and got the nickname Buster before the age of 2 after he tumbled down a long flight of stairs and supposedly just stood up and shook it off. A close friend of the family saw it happen and remarked, "He's a regular Buster," which led Keaton's father using it as a nickname. Because of his natural talent to tumble over without injury, Buster and his parents developed a vaudeville act involving Buster goading and annoying his father. Buster's father would respond by picking him up and throwing him around, into scenery, the orchestra pit, and even the audience. While he found it fun to be thrown around, he eventually adopted a deadpan expression to help with the act, eventually becoming a trademark of his. After falling out with his father and with laws passed regarding children in vaudeville, at the age of 21, Buster and his mother moved to New York. There he met Fatty Arbuckle, who let Buster star in a few of his films. Buster and Arbuckle got along well, with Buster becoming Arbuckle's personal gag writer and eventually getting his own unit to shoot his own films. Many of his films were great successes and he is widely regarded as a pioneer of film, with many of his stunts and gags still referenced to this day. Despite his ability to take a fall, he wasn't entirely indestructible, having broke his neck doing the water tower gag in Sherlock Jr., breaking his ankle while filming The Electric House, and almost being flattened while filming the iconic window scene in Steamboat Bill Jr. Keaton was also in love with trains and read up a lot of train history, especially the Great Locomotive Chase of 1862 during the American Civil War. While trains had appeared in many of his movies, he wanted to make a proper film about the Great Locomotive Chase after reading the novel of the same name in 1926. During the Civil War, a group of Northern Union soldiers commandeered a locomotive named the General from Confederate lines and drove it to Chattanooga with the goal of damaging the railroad that was vital to the Confederate Army. The Confederates pursued the locomotive for 87 miles in a succession of locomotives, including one named Texas, before catching the General. Keaton loved the story and asked the studio if he could make it into a film. After getting the green flag, he wrote the film in about 2 weeks and started production. They shot the film in Oregon and started with a budget of $400,000. 2 Civil War-era locomotives were purchased, with a third being brought to be used in a train wreck. The atmosphere on set was supposedly very fun, and apparently the crew would frequently stop shooting to play baseball. The female star, Marion Mack, said that Buster completely ignored her to begin with, but later came to like her, often playing jokes with her on set. Every Sunday, the crew would play baseball in a nearby field, and supposedly Buster was so good, Mack said he could have been a professional player. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows, however. The producer for the film was becoming angrier at Keaton over growing production costs, with the budget eventually reaching $750,000, as Keaton was building bridges and dams to control the flow of water for the battle scene. There were also numerous accidents on set, such as Keaton being knocked unconscious, an assistant director being shot in the face with a blank cartridge, a train wheel running over a brakeman's foot which resulted in a $2,900 lawsuit, and the wood-burning locomotives causing numerous fires, leading to production having to compensate any farmers for any burnt haystacks. A fire also broke out during the climactic fight scene, and filming had to be put on hold for several weeks until the area was safe to film in again. The fire cost Buster $50,000. The moment where the locomotive Texas was crashed into the river cost $42,000 and stands as one of the most expensive shots in all of silent movie history. Keaton himself could have been killed while performing several stunts, such as jumping between the engine, tender, and several good wagons while it was all moving. The moment where he had to pull a railroad tie off the tracks was especially dangerous, as if he messed up, the train could have been derailed. And the most deceptive stunt of all was the moment he sat on an engine's coupling rod while it was moving. Had the engine suffered from wheel slip, he could have been launched off the rod and badly injured, if not killed. After shooting was complete, Keaton had shot roughly 200,000 feet of film. He began editing in late September, aiming for a late December release. The General premiered on the 31st of December 1926 in Japan and properly released in the US in February of 1927. With a budget of $750,000, the film made $474,264 in the US, but the high production costs meant the studio still had its gripes with the film. On top of that, the film Flesh and the Devil had just swept the box office, and The General, following behind it, was left in the dust. Critics at the time also panned the film for not being very funny for a comedy and one of Buster Keaton's worst films. To start with, the film was told from the point of the Confederates, aka the South, who had lost the Civil War. The story was easier to tell with the Confederates as the heroes, and Buster felt that they wouldn't be viewed as the villains, but he was swiftly told otherwise by critics. The film is also somewhat slow-paced in comparison to some of Buster's other works, leading to many critics becoming bored. Some critics also stated, "Someone should have told Buster Keaton that it is difficult to derive laughter from the sight of men being killed in battle, as there was a gag in the film involving several men being shot, which at the time was rather taboo for cinema, especially a comedy." The film cost Keaton his ability to make films independently, and he was stuck with a production manager for his next 2 films, who would monitor expenses and interfere with the story elements for sake of budget. Keaton later moved on to work for MGM, but because he was held back, he felt his creative input was severely limited. After earning some trust from MGM after making The Cameraman, Keaton got to make some of the more successful films of his career under MGM, albeit without the same energy as his previous unrestrained work. He experimented with sound films as the medium shifted, but they didn't quite work as well as his previous silent work. Keaton left Hollywood in the early 1930s for personal reasons, but returned in 1934, helping write some films and star in others. He had a long career, but it never quite peaked again as he did in the 20s. The story of The General does at least have a happy ending. In 1963, Keaton said he was more proud of the film than any other he had ever made. As times and tastes changed, audiences and critics started to agree with him, with the film now considered a classic of the silent era. In 1989, 23 years after Keaton Keaton's death, the film was selected to become part of the US National Film Registry, alongside other films such as Casablanca, Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, Star Wars, and The Wizard of Oz. Overall, a bit like Vincent van Gogh, The General is another sad example of something that may have just been a little ahead of its time. It's a fantastic film that's in the public domain and an amazing example of silent filmmaking. Had Buster held back, it may have just been another title in his filmography, but it's still a great film to this day. So the moral of the story, I suppose, is to follow your passion and stick to your vision, and that just because some people don't appreciate your work now, doesn't mean people won't appreciate it in the future. If you've been involved in railway circles for long enough, you've probably heard the name Dr. Beeching a few times, mostly said in a more than spiteful manner. So why do rail enthusiasts hold such spite for this man? Well, therein lies a tale of bureaucracy, budget cuts, and beaching. After the end of the First World War, Britain's railways were beginning to face competition from roads in the form of lorries and buses. Railways were still profitable and much more efficient than roads at the time, but it was still growing competition nonetheless. One of the main issues the railways faced was a lack of standardisation, with each having their own engines, rolling stock, and methods of operation. This was somewhat overcome when all 120 railways were grouped into the Big Four: the London North Eastern Railway, the London Midland Scotland, Southern Railways, and the Great Western Railway. But even then, there was still the issue of compatibility between the four. By the end of the Second World War, most of the UK's railways were in poor condition thanks to higher traffic during the war effort, and so were quickly nationalised by 1948. To cut costs, many of the least used branch lines of the time were closed between 1948 and 1962. Closure of these lines helped British Railways save money, but it did lead to protests and the formation of the Railway Development Association. Traffic on British railways remained steady during the early 1950s, but after the end of petrol rationing and the recovery of the economy, car ownership greatly increased, causing a large drop in BR's shares. To add to this, labour costs were beginning to rise faster than their income, and fares and freight charges had to be repeatedly frozen by the government to control inflation. The 1955 modernisation plan was introduced to help with this. It involved replacing their steam locomotives with diesels, an increase in traffic, usage of automatic signalling, closing several smaller low-traffic branch lines, and the new system was projected to be much more profitable by 1962. Unfortunately, the modernisation plan failed and costs only increased more. By 1961, British Railways was losing money fast, nearly £300,000 a day, and needed a radical solution. By this time, 3,000 miles of railway line had been closed, and 26% of railway staff had been made redundant. This was unfortunately not enough, and so Dr. Beeching of the British Railway Board was tasked with writing a report on British Railways and what was to be done to stop it from losing money. Dr. Richard Beeching became the chairman of the British Transport Commission in 1961. He had a PhD in physics and was known to be a technocrat, always thinking with just the facts and making decisions from there. He was never open to the romantic notions or charms of railways or their significance in their country's history. It was all statistics, profit, and loss to him. To say anything good would come out of this report would certainly have been a foolish notion. By 1963, Beeching had written his first report on the British railway network. He talked about smaller branch lines that often saw low traffic, with some stations only earning 10% of what it cost to run them. He also noted that the least used 50% of stations only contributed 2% of passenger revenue, and that 1/3 of route miles carried 1% of passengers. His solution was that out of the 18,000 miles of railway, 6,000 miles would be closed entirely, with a few lines remaining operational for freight traffic only. A total of 2,363 stations were to be closed. He also stated that rail freight should mainly be for bulk commodities, such as minerals and coal, and that the new system of shipping containers should be prioritised over individual goods wagons. His second report was published in 1965, talking about the development of trunk routes. The notion was that many of the mainline services had too many duplicate routes, different stretches of line that led to the same place. and that of the 7,500 miles of mainline railways, only 3,000 miles should be selected for future development. British Railways was desperate to save money, and so Beeching's Axe was set in motion. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the immediate staff working for British Railways that were affected by these cuts, but hundreds of communities such as holiday and coastal towns that relied on the railways to bring in the holiday traffic. These towns were crippled as many rural and coastal railways were chosen for closure, such as those around Devon, East Anglia, Cornwall and the Lake District. Along with these were rural communities and villages that relied on the trains to get to their local towns for market days and for farmers to sell produce, as well as simply people who relied on taking the train to work as opposed to driving. All services on the Isle of Wight were also recommended for closure. Railway closures in Scotland were heavily protested as the cuts would have left much of the Highlands inaccessible, and were kept open as a result. The Central Wales line was also proposed to be cut, leaving most of Wales practically with no railways altogether. However, this too was kept open as it passed through many marginal constituencies. It's a political thing, I'm not even going to try to explain what it is. And nobody dared close it as a result. Several other lines were spared too due to either public backlash or lack of alternate public transport, but these were few and far between compared to the numbers that were cut. Other issues arose around the disposal of land and infrastructure. Most stations would be either demolished or sold for housing, while bridges, cuttings and embankments would be removed or levelled to allow for future development. However, little consideration was put forward for preserving the track bed should the line need to be relaid again in future, an argument that has become more prevalent since the 90s as demand for rail has begun to grow. Some drains and bridges, however, couldn't be removed, and as such required continued maintenance despite serving no purpose, leading many to call the closures short-sighted. Some argue that due to these structures requiring maintenance regardless of usage, it would have made sense to continue running the railways that used them. However, others argue that it would only have cost more to maintain them, and that the services ran along these segments of line wouldn't be profitable enough to justify the cost of operation. The replacement buses that were organised in place of the railways were also a complete failure, as they were slower and less convenient, making them less popular. Ideas for light rail services such as trams, smaller engines or rail buses were suggested, but Beeching quickly shot them down. After 2 years, most replacement bus services had stopped running. By 1968, most of Beeching's plan had been executed, and BR was saving some money, but not as much as they had hoped. Exact figures aren't known, with some reports stating that out of the £100 million BR was losing a year, Beeching only helped them save £30 million, while others state that running costs had been cut by almost £100 million after Beeching. However, these savings were quickly swallowed up by wage increases. Some speculate that by cutting a small number of lines and reducing the number of railway staff per station would have saved BR a similar amount of money. However, these ideas came too little too late. Many of the lines axed by Beeching still stand today, mostly overgrown and in states of decay. Some are now simply walking trails, some have been repurposed as roads, and some have been flattened altogether to make room for housing. A few of these railways have since seen new life as heritage railways, while others have been relayed and opened as demand for rail transport has increased in the last few decades. An interesting footnote to add to this story is the road competition. Motorways were starting to appear all over the country in the late 50s, and in 1959, Ernest Marples became the UK Transport Minister, the same Mr. Marples that owned a successful road construction company. It became a public concern after his company got the rights to build the Hammersmith flyover in 1960, but he went on to sell his shares in the company so as to not be involved in a scandal. He said he'd transferred his shares to an offshore trust, though a popular rumour circulated that he'd really given his shares to his wife. There's a lot of both politics and office politics involved, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but long story short, when Marples brought Dr. Beeching in as his transport chairman, it's not out of the question that his hand may have helped sharpen Beeching's axe. Beeching knew he had struck a nerve with the public, but felt he had done the right thing, saying, "I suppose I'll always be looked upon as the axe man, but it was surgery, not mad chopping." All of this is somewhat a simplification of events. There are a few other factors playing a part in the greater picture and a few other murky details, but those were essentially the main bullet points of Beeching's Axe. The event has forever been a sore point for British railway enthusiasts, as much as it's been a point of contention on whether or not it was right or wrong, and is still regarded as a bad move on Beeching's behalf by the public. The event has affected some aspects of British pop culture too, such as the basis for the BBC TV series Oh Dr. Beeching, Flanders and Swan wrote a lament for the lines closed during the cuts entitled Slow Train, and the satirical magazine Private Eye uses the pseudonym Dr. B. Ching as the name of the author of their Signal Failures column on railway issues. In 2006, the band I Like Trains released the song The Beeching Report as a criticism of the cuts. Hindsight will always be 2020. Beeching's cuts would have never been favoured by the public, but British Railways faced a lot of financial trouble if they didn't go through with it. Whether or not it was the right move will be impossible to know, but it's what we got. A burning train full of dynamite about to blow up a town sounds like a story a child or Michael Bay would come up with. You'd be surprised to hear then that such a story did happen once upon a time in Mexico. In fact, the event is quite a well-known local legend. However, like most local legends, nobody is exactly sure on what's true and what isn't. And that's a good thing. From a young age, Jesus Garcia Corona loved working for his local railroad. He started his career at the age of 17, working as a water boy before quickly rising through the ranks, becoming a guard and eventually a fireman by his 20s. Cheery and hard-working, Garcia quickly became a well-known figure in the town of Nacozari where he lived. He eventually worked his way up to engineer and was found to be more than capable of dealing with the frequent hazards of the work, from donkeys wandering onto the track to preventing full-on accidents. His hard work was noticed by his employers, and in 1904 he was rewarded with an all-expense-paid trip to the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. By then, Garcia was a well-known and highly respected figure among local townsfolk, living by the mantra, "A gift has no end." It's said that on one occasion, while driving a train, the locomotive's brakes failed as it was speeding along. Garcia responded by quickly opening the sanders and putting the engine in full reverse. Supposedly, the train stopped just short of the end of the line. Around a month later, on the 7th of November 1907, he'd be involved in another accident. However, this time, he wouldn't get off so easily. The thing is, nobody seems to be sure exactly what happened on that day. The main story is always the same, but nobody's entirely sure of the finer details. This is what we know for certain. On this day, the regular conductor in charge of organising freight wagons was off sick, and the man tasked with filling in had little experience. A train consisting of several cars of hay and several supply cars loaded with a total of 70 boxes of dynamite destined for the local mine were parked in the freight yard in the town of Nacozari. Usually, any wagon containing explosives should be positioned at the very back of a train. Today, however, they were incorrectly positioned next to the hay wagons by the locomotive. Garcia, while on break, noticed hay had blown onto the supply cars and sparks from the locomotive's funnel lit it on fire. Quickly realizing the train was in range of a powder magazine storing over 500 tons of mining-grade explosives, Garcia ran to the engine, ordered everyone off, and put it in reverse at full speed. Garcia got the train out of town just as the dynamite ignited, destroying the train and killing him instantly. That, as far as I'm aware, is the long and short of it. What makes the story more interesting, though, is every article discussing it has a different telling. Most sources say he drove the engine 6 kilometers out of town. However, some others say he only reached half a mile before it blew up. Given an additional 12 people died as a result of the explosion, 6 kilometers out of town seems too far away for an explosion, even of that scale, to affect anyone else. There's also the matter of which railroad he worked on, as there were two in town. The 8-kilometer long narrow gauge line that led to the mines, or the standard gauge line that led to Douglas, Arizona. A few articles imply he worked the narrow gauge line, with others saying it was the line to Douglas. The direction he travelled in also seems to be a mystery, with the Wikipedia article saying the train travelled downhill. However, another article claims he remained on the train for so long because the line travelled uphill, and that he needed to stay aboard just to make sure the locomotive didn't slip while climbing the gradient. If he went uphill, maps suggest he'd be going towards the mine, but if he was going downhill, then I'm assuming that would mean towards Arizona. These facts, combined with the distance he travelled and the knowledge that he didn't jump from the train, paint an even more confusing picture. If he was only half a mile away from town when the train train exploded, it would make sense that he didn't jump, as he probably didn't have time. However, if the train was going downhill, surely he could have jumped once it was picking up speed, knowing the decline in the rails would have kept it moving. And if it was 6 kilometers downhill, 6 kilometers is a very long way to push something to safety. Surely he would have jumped from the train by at least half that distance. But then let's say he was going towards the mine. If he did go 6 kilometers uphill in that direction, he would have been 3/4 of the way to the mine, and surely he wasn't thinking of driving a train full of burning dynamite towards an operating mine where it'd blow up countless others. Like I said, conflicting information in different articles makes it very difficult to build an exact picture of events. Some articles say he was 25, while others say he was only 23. Some say 6 kilometers, others say half a mile. All we know for certain is that this did happen. Jesus Garcia was a real person and he saved the lives of hundreds by sacrificing his own. The town was renamed Nacozari de Garcia in his honor. Streets, schools, bridges and parks have been named after him. A monument to him was put up in his hometown, and in 1944, the federal government declared that the National Day of the Railroad Worker would be celebrated every 7th of November, the day of the incident. Garcia was, and still is, a national hero, albeit more of a legend these days. The tragedy took place over 100 years ago now, and the exact details of the event have been lost to time, with nobody quite knowing exactly how the incident played out. But I ask you, does it matter that we don't know exactly how it happened? That every article and video about him tells the story differently? Because to me, that's what makes this story legendary. When we know things for certain, there's no more mystery. People lose interest because they know all there is to know, and the event fades into obscurity. But when the details are fuzzy, when nobody knows exactly what happened, when all we know is a guy drove an exploding train out of town to save lives with no other context, we keep thinking about it. And that's what Garcia deserves. It doesn't matter if it was 6 kilometers or half a mile. That mystery is what keeps us talking about him and keeping his legend alive. So let us keep discussing and remembering Jesus Garcia, for he was a gift to all who knew him, and I feel it's only right we honor him by helping him live up to his mantra, that a gift has no end. Railways are no stranger to having assets stolen from them. Notable thefts include stealing gold and money from moving trains, but even things like rails and signalling equipment have been taken by criminals wanting to make a quick penny. Robbery of railway property still happens to this day, some thefts more egregious than others, but none may be more bizarre than the man who was tricked into stealing an entire railway station. Built in 1847 by the Yorkshire and Lancashire Railway, Keaton Central Station stood as a hub for both passengers and goods for many years. It served the people of West Yorkshire about as well as any other station in the world, and had its own fair share of notable accidents, including a handful of runaway trucks derailing and smashing a butcher's shop. But aside from that, was pretty much like any other station in the country. It was absorbed into the LNWR, then the LMS, before finally becoming part of the British Railways system in 1948. By 1965, the station was closed to passengers as part of the Beeching cuts, and by 1969 was closed completely. At this point, half of the station had been demolished, with only the platforms, main station building, and a few sections of track remaining. British Railways, likely busy organising the demolition and disposal of many other stations, left Keaton in its partially standing state for another 2 years before finally getting round to organising a team to pull down the remaining structure. In 1971, a demolition company from Leeds was contracted to remove the rest of the station, with British Railways paying them £2,382 for the job and giving them permission to sell off the materials for profit. However, when they finally arrived at the site, they found the station they'd been contracted to remove was already gone. Both the demolition team and British Railways were baffled as to how a station could just vanish, and so an investigation was launched. A short while later, the culprit was found, a 33-year-old demolition contractor from Dewsbury by the name of Reginald Sedgwick. 24 tons of material had already been removed from the site, including stone, timber, metal, rails, sleepers, buffers, station benches, and more. And so Sedgwick was taken to court in 1972, charged with effectively stealing Keaton's station. Sedgwick, however, denied that he had stolen the station, and claimed that he was in fact contracted to demolish it. He stated that he'd been contacted by a Mr. Watson on behalf of Northern Sites Development in Leeds, offering him £400 to knock down the station for British Railways and letting him sell off the materials for extra profit. With the materials of the station having a combined value of roughly £600, Sedgwick took on the job and paid Watson a £100 bond for the contract, spending an extra £200 hiring the equipment needed, and then over the course of the next 3 weeks tearing down and selling off the station. Naturally, investigators tried to find this Mr. Watson and Northern Sites Development, however, it turned out that neither he nor the company existed, and rather conveniently, Sedgwick had lost the receipt for the bond he'd paid. After finding this out, the prosecution naturally believed that Sedgwick was telling a fat pack of lies and had made up Watson as a scapegoat, stating, quote, "What the case really comes to is that this man, last August, in effect, stole Keaton's station." Sedgwick, however, stuck firmly to his story, admitting that he did demolish the station, but reaffirming that he was contracted to do so by this mysterious Mr. Watson. After 2 days in court, the jury eventually found Sedgwick not guilty of stealing Keaton's station, and accepted that, quote, "he pulled the station down in good faith." Once the case was closed, Sedgwick said he'd continue searching for Mr. Watson, claiming he'd been conned and that, quote, "he owes the £100 bond I paid him and £400 for the job." Given that Sedgwick also paid £200 out of his own pocket to hire the equipment needed to demolish the station, I certainly hope he got his money back in the end. So, what's the lesson to take away from this? Read your contracts, double check to make sure your boss isn't a con man? I'm not entirely sure. What we can say for certain though is that, as terrible as people stealing from railways is, you have to admit, stealing an entire station without British Railways knowing is quite the achievement, and, if I do say, downright hilarious. Subscribe for more.